Lots coming up in a busy hour ahead as usual. But first, let's go to this concept, this urgency, this agenda to open up this country. And I'm joined by Mark Rigotti, who's a business person. He's been part of a project led by Sydney University. Open Society and Common Purpose Taskforce is the name of this project. Mark, thanks for joining us. Can you summarise what this taskforce wants for the country at this stage of the pandemic?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The task force has been working for about 5 months and it wants two things. It wants the country to safely reopen and re-engage with the world, and it wants to rebuild an open society. I think we heard from one of the health officers talking about the false idol of eliminating the virus. We say that feels like we've won the peace, but we are in danger of losing the war because there doesn't seem to be a plan to sort of build back that open, generous society we had, let alone reopen our borders.
Yeah, indeed. It's a real worry, and some of us have been talking about this for month after month after month. And we should say at the outset, of course, everybody understands that you could lose control of the virus. Just because you've been successful up to this point doesn't mean that we need to drop our vigilance. But with vaccines and ongoing quarantine, we remain in a very strong position, surely, to be erring towards opening up rather than closing down further.
We would agree, and the task force took evidence from a range of academic experts and had some roundtables with a broad church of people. And one of the things that we were surprised at was, yes, people are nervous. They don't want to get sick. They don't want their families to get sick, but they also don't want a future where the country's hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world. So we need a psychological runway between where we are now and where we want to be in the future. And I think that's a bit of the frustration. There doesn't seem to be any attempt to build that runway out to help us get urgent about the vaccine and to implement some sensible steps based on health advice, but sensible steps.
Well, clearly, though, politics is playing a role. Being very frightened and protective about the virus has been politically successful for state governments. There's a federal election looming. It's really only Gladys Berejiklian that has been openly pragmatic, willing to deal with a certain amount of infection and willing to back her processes and her public health officers to get them under control.
It's an interesting, you put it well, and I guess we're saying we should try and move from fear to confidence. Why should we do that? If you actually look at how the country has responded to the crisis, apart from a few of the niggles around particular issues, the net response has been pretty good, and we've learnt a lot along the way. National Cabinet might have got everything right, but it's done very, very well. Yeah, so if you look at those lessons, you can build on them.
Well, exactly. I mean, New South Wales is not the case to point to. It's not the template just because it errs towards keeping open, but also it's dealt with the vast majority of people returning and therefore the vast majority of infected people through quarantine. So obviously it can be done effectively.
Yeah, that's right. I forget the number, but it's something like 500,000 people have actually returned to Australia in the last 14 months. And the vast majority have done so safely. So we do have it within us to do it. It just needs some leadership and some resolve.
Now, politicians are tentatively talking about opening up the country, the international borders. Of course, we understand the caution. But are you worried that they're setting the vaccination targets too high? They're talking about if all of us are vaccinated. Now, once we get 6 or 7 million people vaccinated, that's obviously got all the people over 65 covered and all those who are frontline in the front line or who are sick or vulnerable. Surely for the rest of the population, it's their choice, isn't it?
Look, I think so. With the work of the task force, where we landed was to open up while vaccinating, not after everyone is vaccinated. But we'd supplement that with several other things. We'd supplement it with rapid testing at the border, with some sort of certification for people coming in and out of the country, and frankly, to do some pilots around some sectors and places that could really benefit from being in front of the curve. For example, international students, agricultural workers. And we've done some experiments like the Australian Open in Melbourne, which was pretty successful in moving quite a lot of people in. So it's not just vaccines, it's some of those other elements as well, I think, Chris, is what we would advocate.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about a practical, rational and optimistic path forward, as you are, though, do you think that you're just bashing your head against a brick wall? When you look at that news poll today, 73% of the country say, no, keep us shut down till at least the middle of next year.
Yeah, it's interesting. Polls are interesting. It always depends on the question you asked. So we did some polling, and there were two interesting things that came out of it from 2 weeks ago. The first was the majority of Australians do not think COVID is going away under 5 years, if ever. So it kind of tells you that your base case is COVID is with us for the medium term. So the country's got a choice to make: open up or stay closed down. The second thing the polling found was if you ask people around doing sensible, staged, limited reopening, and to help some of those industries that have been hit the hardest. Again, it's not a big majority, but there was a majority support for those sorts of sensible steps rather than open slather opening. Well, but it is hard. It is hard.
It is difficult, Mark, but I appreciate the work you're doing. It's important, and we've got to push against that door. People, you don't want to be reckless. We've got to be cautious, but we've got to push towards opening the economy up. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Mark Rigotti there, who's a business person who's been involved in this Sydney University body called the Open Society for Common Purpose. We've got to try and get our politicians on the front foot, trying to do more in this area rather than hiding behind frightened dooners, as they like to say.